Hello there and welcome back to the Background Dancer YouTube channel. My name is Jason Yup and you are watching Mosaic in Malaysia. Now, if you do not know what Mosaic in Malaysia as a project is yet, don't worry, you could always go back and check out the previous 2 episodes because over there I have already given you a very in-depth detailing introduction as to the project. Mosaic in Malaysia is completely different from what I usually do on the main podcast that you can find on all your favorite podcast directories. But fret not, I will also just give you a very quick nutshell as to what this is all about. So, Mosaic in Malaysia is a very special extension to the main podcast because over on that side, it's completely audio only and we talk mostly about the career-oriented aspects of the dance ecosystems, all the different infrastructures that really support performing as a whole. Whereas in Mosaic in Malaysia, on this very special YouTube extension of the platform, I go a completely different route because over here we zone in on the Malaysian art scene and we talk very specifically about solutions and policies. So you can always think of it as more of a think tank / sort of pitch pad kind of platform because that's one of the things I thought about when trying to reconnect with my Malaysian friends back home where I kind of grew up in when I first started my Malaysian dance career. So there you have it, a very quick nutshell as to the project. We'll be talking a little bit further on throughout the next 2 episodes, of course, as to what the future of this very special extension will be, so definitely stay tuned for that. But without further ado, this is episode 3 of Mosaic in Malaysia and we have already covered dance in the 2 previous episodes, so here we're going to talk about theatre. Yes, in the previous episode, I already had a conversation with J.S. Wong, and for this episode, I will talk to a completely different Wong in Kelvin Wong. Now, Kelvin Wong is a up-and-coming, very fresh blood in the Malaysian art scene, but I have already seen some of his work and am already a huge fan of his incredible repertoire and thinking behind theatre. So who exactly is Kelvin Wong, you may ask? Kelvin Wong is currently the lecturer and program leader in the Diploma for Performing Arts for the film department at the Sunway University School of Arts. But most importantly, he's also the artistic director of Theatresauce, a director-driven collective that was founded in 2016 and based in USJ Subang Jaya. Now, this very particular episode, we will be discussing the quite contentious debate between private and public education within the performing arts. Without further ado, hope you enjoy this episode and I'll see you on the other side. Before we begin things, I just really wanted to share with you a little anecdote here, right? Like, I remember growing up in primary school, secondary school, and the only forms of like arts education I ever gotten was, music and a little bit of drawing, actually. Right. So these are the things that I kind of grew up with and never really knew. And then now, of course, I'm a dancer. So that's kind of weird. It's kind of ironic that, none of these public sort of educational things that I got contributed to my future well-being, to my future vocation. So this all kind of leads back into my first big curiosity. And that is, apart from public education, right? Like, I really would like to know, does privatization of theater and performing arts actually benefit the industry? Because when I was about 15 and 16, I started to see the boom of such industries. So big schools coming up like the Gardens, like Sri KDU and all these, and they were sort of offering all these really customized, incredibly well-to-do programs for arts education. And I think theater education was a large part in that. So just to kick things off, what are your thoughts on the privatization of theater or performing arts education?
I mean, before I respond to the question, first off, again, thank you for having me, Jason. Right, and I am just curious as to whether did the music and fine arts education that you had when you were younger, did you feel like it it helped you a little bit in terms of the artistry and the thinking of you as a dancer? Because I would say that what I did in primary school and in secondary school, to an extent, right, in terms of music education and fine arts education, also that has impacted the way that I make theater today, also.
Ooh, that's a good one. I have to be honest, I don't think so, because the way we were taught was very much to be in that production mode, right? Like all to fulfill grades. You have to do your homework, basically. So although maybe I had a real slight, I would say, memory that I could sing quite well, or I was drawing certain things quite well, they never really contributed to anything meaningful at the very end of the day. And once I passed those subjects, that was it. That was over. So nobody rewarded anyone for being good in class, for being good in music or drawing in arts. Like that was basically just sort of an afterthought.
So you then would then come from a place of it being offered as a subject like any other subjects that have been taught in school, and that was it. It just ended there, and it might not necessarily have a correlation with what you then do later in life.
Exactly. Yeah. And,
right.
Yeah. And I'm speaking from two ends, right? Because my primary school was purely government. And then when I went to secondary school, it was semi-government, but it was mostly private. So those two models kind of still had the same outcome with regards to arts. Yeah.
Right. That it was more outcome based as opposed to the experience itself. As you mentioned, with all these private institutions, that there is a kind of a personalization
exactly.
to it. Yeah. So going back to your question, I think when you talk about privatization, there is then a different value that is being placed on a similar commodity, right? And that, fortunately or not, is the way that we also see things whenever something is made public, right? Public versus something that is offered privately, right? So this goes the same with vaccines. This goes the same with health, medicine in terms of services, right? And this also trickles all the way back to the arts. So the interpretation of this same commodity changes when something is being privatized, right? So there are two ways to look at it. One of the pros, of course, is that when things are being privatized, that allows for more people to expand further on this privatization, meaning that there's not only one company that could do it, there could be 100 companies who could bank on this idea of privatization, right? So this also means that there is greater access, right? So immediately with privatization, there is greater access, as you mentioned, Jason, right? This access of a more personalized approach to the performing arts. Of course, a con of that would be then with privatization, because the value of it changes, because that is also edged to a certain commodified value, right? One needs to pay for it, right? Anything that is offered in the private sector is essentially something that you can either afford or you cannot afford. And because of this affordability, that then opens up this can of worms where it is only accessible to a certain particular demographic, right? So again, the good thing is there is more access, but then the not so good thing is that this access is only accessible by a certain section of a community who can then afford to pay for these commodities, right? And of course, if we talk about greater access, that would mean that with theater/performing arts education, there are greater opportunities. There are greater varieties. There are greater choices also in terms of which school do you want to go to in order to receive this highly personalized education. It also opens up to different forms of thinking, different perspectives in a larger scope, right? And at the same time, with private companies, there's also a greater level of autonomy in the sense that you're not governed by a particular structure that is required by, say, the government, right? This goes the same, whether you are in education or if you are a private say, performing arts company, you then have greater autonomy in terms of deciding what your projects are, what you want to get across to your students, and you then determine what the context of the education is, right? So with the private sector coming in, I feel like there is a wider formalization, right, of performing arts education. And at the same time, we look at tertiary institutions that do offer theater/performing arts education. There is also a wider scope, greater perspectives, opportunities in terms of research and creative output, right? But then I would always scale back to this idea that with privatization comes this idea that as much as they would like the greater access, they might not necessarily penetrate into the mass market, because the issue of affordability then comes in. And I feel like if we are going to go back to, say, forming policies, then my question would then come in terms of how can privatization also ensure that the underprivileged or those who are not able to necessarily immediately afford to allow themselves into private education to also have the chance. So that is something that I am also thinking about.
Well, mentioning about affordability, we've also discussed about this dichotomy between inclusivity and exclusivity, right? Whenever we try to create something that's exclusive or inclusive, then the other naturally happens as well. So we cannot seem to avoid this dichotomy, and it just kind of becomes sort of the fabric of society and also performing arts education. So I would probably want to write a love letter to the private sector, although it kind of also involves the public sector, which is like, we've seen a growing trend of parents thinking and feeling that the performing arts, and mostly, of course, I know, theater, dance, being a viable career heading into the future for kids. So they become more willing to send all these kids to much more, well, let's say, expensive educational programs, and they're more willing to pay for these programs, right? But my question to you then is this really just a private thing? Is the public sector also in contention for the same market, or is this something completely for the private sector to capitalize on?
I think we're talking about different target audiences, different demographics also, right? In the sense that, see, when something is offered for mass public consumption, for instance, okay, we've got this program over here, basically anyone can apply and it is not very expensive, right? Versus something that is offered by a private education institution, right? That is possibly 5 times the price. There is also public perception that sometimes when you are paying for something, the value of it is higher. Now, that might not necessarily be true, but then that there is a perception, a skewed perception nevertheless, that comes together with that. And I feel like that also impacts the experience that people do go through when they are in either, say, the public sector or in the private one. I would say that the private sector has done, we talk about private education, performing arts institutions have done a good job in terms of providing the frequency, the consistency, as well as the exposure to the performing arts, right? We see parents' belief systems change over time because we see more schools cropping up. We see a greater consistency that is then related to the output from these institutions, and at the same time we see greater exposure and experience of these kids, right, who have gone through these institutions and having come out graduated from these places, right? And so parents would then see that, and it then becomes an aspiration, right? Like, for instance, I see this private institution offering this, and my kid wants to also go through that same experience, but I'm going to work a little bit more in order to allow my kids to afford that, because there is also an aspiration, which we go back to this idea of value that is etched to this idea that if you pay more for something, right, I'm able to to live up to that particular standard that I aspire towards, right? So I would say again, there are positives, and the negatives would be, of course, this idea that just because you're paying more for something, it doesn't mean that it might necessarily be better, right? And at the same time, I feel like there is a lot of untapped possibilities with public education institutions that I feel like communities, particularly more affluent communities, might not necessarily be opening themselves up to experiencing also, right? Mm-hmm. And so what we then see is this divide of, hey, those who cannot afford it, right, would then possibly go to the public sector, and those who can would then go to the private. And I feel like this dichotomy, this division, might not necessarily be very healthy in the long run.
Hmm.
Because this then informs eventual output from the public sector of the performing arts and the private, and the private sector of the performing arts, right? And I believe it actually starts from education itself, right? That the output and the audience, even the audience of the performing arts from public, from more public performing arts institutions versus the private ones are quite different. They're quite vast in terms of demographics also, right? And I feel like it can be trickled back all the way to the way that education also works in this country.
Okay, so you already mentioned it. There is a growing divide between the public and private sector. Yeah. Now, I guess the question really becomes, how do we avoid it being too large a schism?
I think that's quite a tricky question, because it involves large policies, right?
Yeah.
Then I would then wonder, I don't have a solution. I wonder, how can the public and private sector be working together to lessen that divide? How can we then work together with, each with our strengths and vulnerabilities and weaknesses? How can we then band together to then work together towards what we all aspire towards, which is a more vibrant, a more commodifiable, a more profit-driven / revenue revenue.
Like a long-term, much more long-term, sustainable.
Yeah, a more sustainable, commodifiable, revenue-driven industry, right? I mean, because if we talk about an industry, you cannot push aside this idea that money is involved. And I always believe that if the public and private sectors come together, very similar to what we did with the vaccines, right? Initially, it was a government thing, and then the private sectors then came in to join forces, and that is how we managed to vaccinate our population to the point where we are one of the highest in Southeast Asia at this point, right? So, can we take a leave from that, and can we allow ourselves to put our egos down, put our differences, be aware of our differences, but then at the same time, work towards what we can do in terms of each other's strengths. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to just roll back a little bit to what you said before, which is when a parent, for example, sends a kid to a private institution compared to a public institution, already the expectation there is, okay, I'm paying a bit more. This is more commodifiable. I have very set expectations as to what the outcome or the output is for this child, right? So I believe myself, and I, of course, throughout my experiences also know that a lot of people go into the performing arts, whether it be theater, music, dance, whatever the matter is, knowing and hoping that the zenith, the epitome of that industry is to become the performer, right? It's to become that star on stage. Now, then it's not necessarily the reality. A lot of people do not make it professionally as a performer. So, but at the same time, people are still able to carve out very successful careers, doing a bunch of other stuff. Now, I'm also an advocate of those things. The diversity of our industry is far beyond what we can imagine just being on stage, right? So now the question really goes back to regarding privatization and how a privatized institution can sort of hone an artist's specific skill set to become a performer. I'm not sure what the statistics are, but I think this is a completely different conversation between what the public and the private sector's graduates perform in the industry. Now, the question to you is then, is becoming a performer, a professional performer, necessary to gain any kind of success within the industry? And this is, I think, an ongoing debate as to whether I have to be a performer in order to further my career into other things heading into the future. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. When you mention performer, do you specifically mean people who are in front of a camera and people who are on stage? And we're not talking about directors, writers, backstage people. Okay, all right. I feel like you see, I mean, this is tricky because I do know individuals who have graduated from the public sector, right, with performing experience, who are doing very well right now, and I can say the same for those. For a few individuals from the private sector as well. Similarly, there are individuals from who have graduated from the public from public tertiary institutions who are not particularly successful, but I can say the same for those in the private sector also, right? So in regards to your question in terms of is being a performer necessary to achieve a kind of a level of success, I would then say not necessarily, because I mean success is very subjective, right? Because success can be seen from different viewpoints. Success to some people would mean that I have 2 million ringgit, right? I have racked up 2 million ringgit in savings from my career in my bank account. Success to some people might be the depth of the craft and the work and how their knowledge and the extent of their research makes them very happy, and that equates to what success is. Success to some people could be in the form of outreach, right? The more my work reaches out to people, the more successful I am. Some might regard success to be, okay, I've got 1.5 million Instagram followers, and that is success to me. For some people, experience might be what they would measure as success. So I would say that success is highly subjective, and I would say that being able to be on stage as a kind of a foundation to what success is in the future is also going to be highly subjective, right? I would say, of course, having that experience of a drama class or having an experience being in a drama club in a university for 1 year would, of course, give you that edge of, over someone who does not have that experience. Same goes as well, right? If you've gone through a kind of a structured education, whether from a private or public institution, right, would give you that edge over others who don't. Same goes for if I didn't go to school for formal performing arts education, but that I have racked up and I've learned from the best teachers who have been my mentors, right? Compared to those who don't, I might actually have that edge over graduates who have just graduated from tertiary institutions. So I think it all boils down to what your personal definition of success is, and at the same time, how can that then push you to experience things that you might not necessarily have experienced before.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because success, of course, like you said, is not only very subjective, but it's hard to gain success to whatever level in the first place, right? Like if you want to use the word success,
absolutely.
It's hard to even say, I want to have success. What does that even mean? Like, yeah, but, okay, I need your help here to navigate some stuff. And this is, pertaining to something that happened here in my own company in Slovakia right now, where, our boss, who has been at the company for 23 years, finally decided to retire, right? So in the hope of recruiting a new boss or a new director, let's say, one of the criterion, set of criteria in the recruitment process is that the person needs to have at least a master's degree. Now, this makes completely no sense because we're not an institution. We're not an educational institution. We're a professional dance company. We're fully practice based. So I really did not get that. I was like, the only thing I've ever heard of this ever happening is, of course, in, educational institutions where you need to at least now have a PhD and master's. Sure. People who have bachelors nowadays are just the run of the mill. Like it's not even surprising anymore. Everyone has a bachelor's. Everyone has a diploma. You must at least have a master's or at least a PhD, right? So now this also goes back to, we talk about education so much. I think tertiary education is, for me, the highest point of any kind of education that we can gain towards any kind of professional career. But with the world changing so quickly, now, what level of educational qualifications do we actually need to, not gain success, but to really excel in the arts? Yeah, it's a hard question, I understand, because it's quite varied, but at the same time, everyone seems to be going for masters and PhDs right now. I'm not sure I want to do that myself, but does the ecosystem, does the industry render it necessary?
So we are talking about two things over here, right? So if we were to bring in, say, tertiary education institutions in, regardless of whether it's private or public, you then choose to go through a more structured / formal mode of receiving an education that is related to then your performing arts field, right? Then this comes with certain modes of thinking and doing that is particular to that particular university, right? So, for instance, if you were to go to Performing Arts School A, they will have their own syllabus and their own way of doing things, which will ultimately affect the way that you think, you do, and what your philosophies are. Same goes, if you were to then go to, say, institution B, you are going to graduate, yes, with the same degree or with the same master's degree or with the same or with the same prefix of a PhD, right, before your name, right? But then the mode of thinking then is different. Then my question comes in terms of whether should education open you up to wider perspectives, or should it close you in and go, I graduated from this school and I think that certain way, and I'm going to think that certain way for the rest of my life. So I have encountered individuals who have graduated from certain schools who are extremely open to learning about new ways of thinking, new ways of doing, and it makes them very exciting to collaborate with. And I also know individuals who have gone through certain streams of education abroad who then come back to our country and then go, everything else that everyone's doing is wrong. And the way that I'm thinking and the way that I've been taught is the right way to go. And so the way that I then judge or come in and perceive other forms of work, which might not fit into what my idea of art is, that, in the way that I've been taught, is basically not good art or is wrong, right? So I have encountered both, and I feel like education should open you up to possibilities. I feel like the more that you know, the more you actually don't, and I find that to be a very, very, very exciting thing, right? And it's this thing of when you come back with a master's or a PhD, from a higher education institution, right? Are you able to observe artists who might not have gone through that similar education as you did? That you're able to look at them and then go, this is a different mode of thinking. It's a different mode of learning, thinking, and my PhD and my master's, whatever it is, whatever qualification that I have from this particular school, does not put me at a level that is any higher than my colleagues who did not go through that same trajectory. And I feel like that's very important, right? Because the dangers that also come with education is that we tend to form cliques. We tend to form groups among, okay, I want to hang around with other individuals, with the same qualifications as I do, versus someone else who, okay, this person did not go through formal education, so this person knows, and quote unquote knows lesser than I do, and hence I do not want to collaborate with this person. So you can see how education can sometimes also divide people, because again, the value that people place from what they have paid for, from the time that they have spent in terms of receiving a certain kind of education, can either be useful or it could also be highly detrimental.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of that, one of the favorite things I like to do when I traverse across the world is to ask people where they graduated from and just kind of have an idea of like their reactions to where they originated from, right? Like the reputation of the institution, for example, like you said, the prestige of that particular degree or PhD, for example, whatever that case is.
It becomes part of your identity. It becomes part of your identity, and we carry that identity around, right? But I find that to continue on evolving as artists, I feel like schools, education institutions should teach and nurture artists who are able to open themselves up to an array of experiences, not just during their university years, not just when they are attending this particular academy, but then to also open themselves up to collaborating, to this idea of interdisciplinary work, of this idea of hey, working with someone who might be trained very differently from you might actually be a very good thing. Right. And I feel like we live in such a globalized world. We live in such a an interconnected world, right? Where any sort of information that we can get it, just by clicking on a couple of buttons on a keyboard, right? So with that interconnectedness, this idea that there is one prestigious school, or there are a few prestigious schools versus all the other schools are basically crap, or if you didn't go to school at all, right, you are not of a particular value. I feel like we are moving away from that already. We are living in a world, this is like we're living in a kind of a post modern world where there is no one grand narrative of, hey, if you graduated from X university versus if you graduated from this academy versus, I think it all boils down to the work that you create, and I feel like the more exciting works that I've seen from come out recently are those that cross borders, cross boundaries, cross disciplines, and cross experiences, and definitely cross qualifications.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, I think it's really important.
Sure. Yeah. I think going back to what you mentioned about okay, you need a master's in order to be the artistic director of a certain company, which that would mean that the board of directors would then place a certain value onto this idea that if you have a master's education, you then come with a certain level of experience. You come with a few fields in which you might be an expert in. You might not necessarily be an artistic person, right? But then that might be what specifically the board of directors might actually be looking for. Because you see, again, going back to a kind of a formalized education ensures that you do receive certain things while you are there for 1, 2, or 3 years, right? Compare it to, say, okay, I do know people also who are completely against formal education for the arts, right? Because they believe that you cannot really learn the arts, right? That the arts is basically in it. It is inside of you, and you just need to find ways in which you are able to then unleash it and then continue practicing it. But then that also comes with its own caveat, where the question comes down to, do you then have the discipline to actually keep up? Or are you just philosophizing, right? This fantasy of not going to school and being able to survive as an artist, but then if you're going to, for instance, be at home constantly thinking about this and not doing anything about it, you're not going to go anywhere, right? So I would say then going to school helps you with that because tertiary education requires a certain level of vigor, of rigor, of discipline, right? That is required of you, and I feel like that is something that I feel a lot of people find to be very helpful.
So there you have it, episode 3 of Mosaic in Malaysia featuring Kelvin Wong and theatre. Now today we discussed about private versus public education. So before we go, here is a very quick recap. Number 1, increased accessibility. Now with the boom of private institutions offering such programs across the nation, we have also seen much more democratization, autonomy, as well as customization to one's program needs. Number 2, private education as a commodity. Now with much higher fees, we of course can also expect higher expectation and perceived value of such programs, which have actually resulted in more people, the public and parents, willing to also send their kids to such programs, hoping for a much better result in their careers. Number 3, value of institutional prestige. So you may ask, what exactly is the value of coming from a very prestigious institution, having a very prestigious master's or PhD? Do all these things contribute to one's success in a very long and hopefully very important career? So which was your favorite policy? Definitely comment and reach out below. I would love to hear your thoughts, and of course if you have any very specific ideas that you can also contribute to this incredible think tank that we're building here, do so down in the comments below as well. I'm all over social, so you can also reach me by LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. All the links are below. Definitely talk to me and reach out. Now, this is episode 3, which means we have one more episode, and that would also be part 2 of our conversation with Kelvin Wong. In the next episode, we talk about audience engagement in theatre, and we also talk about a very special, well, also very popular series going on in Netflix now. Which one would that be? Well, stick around, we'll see very soon. Don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and bell button so that you get notified for more future content like this. Also helps with the algorithms, as you know. Share it about with your friends and anyone who may benefit from such a content. That would be really great. Thank you so much for that. And most importantly, also check out The Background Dancer at your favorite podcast directories. We talk about all things career, all things dance, and all things background about dance over on that side. Thank you so much once again, and I will see you in the next one.